The sky burned red as the battle raged on, the air thick with the acrid scent of blaster fire and the sharp metallic tang of blood. Captain Marlowe Calloway crouched behind the wreckage of a broken transport vehicle, her heart hammering in her chest. The shouts of her comrades were drowned out by the deafening explosions echoing through the desolate landscape. She never imagined her last moments would come like this, alone, with her team scattered, and the enemy closing in. "Move out! Move out!" she yelled into her calm voice, barely audible over the chaos. But no response came. There was no time for hesitation. She peeked over the crumpled chassis, scanning the horizon. The Zeltri forces had them cornered, a full battalion armed to the teeth. Their sleek, silver armor glinted in the harsh light, and their crimson energy rifles hummed ominously. Every move they made was calculated, efficient, everything the humans weren't. The galaxy had warned them about the Zeltri. They were ruthless, methodical, and merciless. And now, they were picking off the last of Earth's soldiers. The ground shook as another explosion went off nearby, sending debris flying. A chunk of metal grazed Marlowe's shoulder, the sharp sting of it momentarily distracting her. She clenched her teeth, ignoring the pain. There was no time to bleed out. She needed a plan. But what good was a plan when you were outnumbered 10-1, with no reinforcements, and the enemy was led by General Korvrax? The very name sent a chill down her spine. He was known across the galaxy as the embodiment of cold precision, the one who'd wiped out entire fleets without breaking a sweat. She had seen his image on the holoboards, tall, menacing, with sharp, predatory features, and now he was here, with a personal vendetta against humanity. Marlowe's eyes darted back to the fallen soldiers around her. Some were still breathing, others weren't. She could almost hear the mocking laughter of the Zeltri soldiers, their cruel amusement at the sight of the humans scrambling for survival. The worst part was that they hadn't even bothered to make it quick. This was torture, a demonstration of power. "Captain Calloway!" A voice crackled in her earpiece, barely audible. It was Lieutenant Harper, one of the few survivors. His voice was strained, fear seeping through the static. "We're surrounded. They're cutting us down. We can't." The calm went silent, replaced by the harsh sound of static. Marlowe's heart skipped a beat. No. She couldn't lose Harper too. Not now. She had to do something. With a grim determination, she bolted from behind the cover, her boots pounding against the dirt as she dashed toward the enemy's position. She didn't have much time. The Zeltri were already advancing, their steps heavy, their weapons raised. They saw her. She could see the moment they realized she was still alive, still fighting. "Human!" one of the Zeltri soldiers sneered, his voice deep and guttural. "You're all the same. Weak. Pathetic." Marlowe didn't flinch. She'd heard this before. The galaxy thought humans were a joke. Too fragile. Too soft. They had underestimated her kind for far too long. She raised her rifle, eyes narrowing as she aimed for the closest Zeltri. "Your arrogance will be your downfall," she muttered under her breath, squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out, the laser beam striking the soldier square in the chest. He dropped, his body twitching as it hit the ground. "One down," Marlowe whispered to herself. But there was no time to celebrate. The others were closing in. Another Zeltri soldier aimed his rifle at her, his hand steady as he fired. Marlowe dove to the side, the blast grazing her side, but she rolled back to her feet in a fluid motion, her training kicking in. There was no room for hesitation. She couldn't afford to be distracted. From her peripheral vision, she saw movement, a figure sprinting toward her. It was Harper, or what was left of him, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He was limping, barely holding on to his rifle. "Captain? We need to fall back," he shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Marlowe's jaw tightened. "There's no falling back, Harper. Not anymore." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. They had been abandoned. Their outposts, their people, all left to die in this wasteland. The Galactic Alliance had promised support, yet here they were, facing extinction alone. Harper staggered beside her, clearly struggling to keep up. "What's the plan, Captain?" he asked, fear evident in his voice. Marlowe's mind raced, but there was no plan. There was no escape. Only one thing left to do: fight to the bitter end. If she was going to die here, it wouldn't be without taking some of the Zelthree scum with her. She nodded grimly. "We hold them off. We fight, no matter what." The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to reality. There were more of them. They were closing in, and she couldn't keep running. She turned to Harper, giving him a fierce, determined look. "You're with me, Lieutenant. We take them down together." Harper hesitated for a moment, looking at the chaos around them, but then his shoulders squared. "Aye, Captain." Without another word, they both stood side by side, weapons raised. The Zelthree were only a few meters away now, their weapons primed and ready to fire. Marlowe's finger hovered over the trigger, and for a split second, everything went silent in her mind. Then, without warning, the air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the cries of pain from both sides mixing with the relentless explosions. Marlowe moved like a blur, weaving through the smoke, taking out Zelthree soldiers one by one, her every shot precise. But they kept coming. More of them. The numbers seemed endless. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her shoulder as another blast connected, sending her stumbling to the ground. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself back up. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Then, in the distance, she saw it, General Korvrax, standing tall and imperious, watching the carnage unfold like a spectator at a gladiatorial arena. His cold, calculating gaze met hers for a fleeting moment. And in that instant, something inside Marlowe snapped. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for something greater. Humanity's future, and the galaxy's respect. She stood, a new resolve burning in her chest. She would make him pay. This wasn't over. Not yet. Marlowe's breath came in ragged gasps, each one a painful reminder of the blast to her shoulder. Blood soaked her uniform, but she didn't dare stop. Not yet. The sound of battle raged around her, gunfire, explosions, the screams of soldiers caught in the crossfire. But the only thing that mattered now was the figure standing at the edge of the battlefield, staring down at her like a predator eyeing its prey. General Korvrax. He was tall, impossibly so, his dark armor gleaming under the burning sun. His eyes, cold and unblinking, studied her every movement with clinical precision. The same icy gaze she had seen on countless holoscreens during the endless reports about the Zelthree conquest. But now, it was no longer just a name on a screen, it was the face of humanity's nightmare. "Captain Calloway!" Vrax's voice boomed across the battlefield, a deep, commanding tone that seemed to freeze the very air around her. "You humans have fought valiantly. But your time is over." Marlowe's pulse quickened. She knew this moment was coming. She had known the instant she laid eyes on Vrax that this was where it would all lead. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a stand. About showing the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. She staggered, her rifle still gripped tightly in her hands, though the weight of it felt more like a burden now. Harper's limp form was beside her, his eyes wide with fear. He hadn't seen the general yet, but she knew he could sense the shift in the air. "Harper, stay with me," Marlowe said, her voice rough but steady. He didn't answer, his face pale as he glanced nervously at the Zelthree soldiers closing in. It was clear the lieutenant wasn't sure how long he could keep going. They had both been running on fumes since the beginning of the assault. Marlowe took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She had to keep her head in the game. If they were going to die here, they would take as many of the enemy as possible with them. Vrax took a single step forward, and the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. "Your kind has never been anything more than a nuisance," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But I'll give you credit for one thing, your determination is impressive. If only your tactics matched your resolve." Marlowe clenched her teeth. "We don't need tactics to take you down. Just will." She raised her rifle, aiming directly at his chest. The blast sent a flash of blinding light streaking across the field, but the general didn't flinch. The shot ricocheted off his armor like a pebble off a steel wall. He didn't even blink. Pathetic, Vrax muttered, his voice laced with disdain. Is this what you've reduced yourselves to? A last-ditch effort that will accomplish nothing? Harper was still standing beside her, breathing heavily. Captain, we can't. Shut up, she hissed, her eyes never leaving Vrax. She had no time for doubt. There was no more room for hesitation. We fight. We die on our feet. The Zelthri general's lips curled into a cruel smile. Very well. If death is what you want, I'll be happy to oblige. He raised his own weapon, an energy rifle unlike anything the humans had ever seen. Its barrel crackled with blue lightning, radiating a raw, destructive energy. Marlowe's heart pounded in her chest as he aimed it directly at her. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. She could hear the wind rustling through the wreckage, the sounds of distant gunfire, the faint cries of soldiers still struggling to survive. But everything faded as the general's weapon hummed with lethal intent. And then, without warning, a blinding flash of light lit up the battlefield. The shot fired, but not at her. Instead, it slammed into one of the advancing Zelthri soldiers, sending him flying through the air. Marlowe blinked in surprise. Who? She started, but then she saw them. A squad of human soldiers, armored in the black and silver of the Earth Defense Forces, emerged from the smoke. The cavalry had arrived. Her heart surged with hope. It wasn't too late. Not yet. Captain Calloway! A voice shouted through the chaos. It was Colonel Jensen, the leader of the reinforcements. His voice was gruff, but there was a glimmer of something else there, determination. We've got your 6. Fall back and regroup. Marlowe didn't hesitate. She grabbed Harper by the arm, dragging him with her as she sprinted toward the new arrivals. The ground shook with every explosion, but the sight of fresh soldiers filled her with renewed energy. On your feet, Lieutenant! She barked. Harper's gaze was still fixed on the general, his eyes wide with disbelief. But we're losing, he said, his voice faltering. We're outnumbered. The Zelthri. We fight, Harper! Marlowe snapped, her grip tightening on his arm. We don't back down. Not ever. Together they reached the group of soldiers, just as another volley of fire from the Zelthri crashed against the walls of the ruined settlement. Marlowe pushed Harper behind cover and turned to face the battle once more. Jensen's squad took up positions beside her, their rifles raised and ready. You're going to want to stay down, Captain, Jensen said. We'll handle this. But Marlowe didn't want to stay down. Not when she had the chance to fight back. No, she said firmly. We finish this. We take them all down. The battle intensified. The reinforcements had thrown the Zelthri off balance, but they were still the overwhelming force. Marlowe could see them regrouping, preparing to mount another wave of attack. She didn't know how long they could hold out. But there was no turning back now. Get ready, she said, turning to the soldiers around her. This is our last shot. They nodded grimly, their faces set in resolve. They weren't going to let Vrax win. Not today. And as the Zelthri forces gathered for their final assault, Captain Marlowe Calloway made a vow. The Zelthri would learn just how dangerous humanity could be when cornered. They would learn that no matter how powerful they were, they had underestimated the will of the human spirit. And she would make sure of it. The smoke of battle still hung thick in the air, coating the ruined city in a grim haze. The distant rumble of artillery fire echoed through the shattered streets, mingling with the cries of soldiers and the whir of damaged machines. Marlowe stood at the edge of a crumbling wall, her chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly began to fade, leaving behind an ache in every muscle. Her hands trembled around the grip of her rifle. Beside her, Harper knelt, wiping the sweat from his brow, his face still pale from the battle. His fingers were stiff from holding his weapon too long, but he refused to show weakness. The reinforcements had made the difference, but the battle wasn't over. It had only just shifted. Captain, Harper murmured, his voice hoarse. How long do we hold out? They'll be back with more. Marlowe's gaze drifted to the horizon. The Zeltari forces, though momentarily disoriented, were regrouping. She could see the lines of their command center, and it wasn't far from their position. Vrax would be coming for them. It wasn't a question of if, it was when. We hold until the last, Marlowe replied, her voice steady. We can't give them an inch. Not now. Harper looked like he wanted to say something more, but he held his tongue, knowing better than to argue. He was right to be concerned. The Zeltari were powerful, relentless, and their technology was far superior to anything humanity had ever known. Yet Marlowe had learned something over the years that no battle-hardened soldier could deny. Heart could match firepower. The fire inside her, inside all of them, was stronger than any weapon. And it would be enough. Colonel Jensen, Marlowe called, her voice carrying across the battlefield. Jensen emerged from the smoke, his squad forming up behind him. His battle-worn face was grim, but his eyes showed the same fierce determination. We've got to push, Marlowe said, her hands still gripping her rifle with white knuckles. I know they're coming. But we can't let them think they've won. Jensen nodded slowly. You think we can take their command center? We don't have a choice, Marlowe replied. If we don't take out their leadership, it won't matter how many we kill, they'll just keep coming. She turned to face the rest of the squad, her voice growing louder. We push through, take out Vrax, and we end this now. If we fall, it ends with us. If we don't fall, it ends with them. Jensen exchanged a quick look with his soldiers. He knew the risk. He knew the stakes. We'll do it, Jensen said, his voice solid and unwavering. But Captain, this isn't going to be clean. We'll have to fight every step of the way. That's how it's always been, Marlowe said, a fire igniting in her chest. Now let's make sure it ends on our terms. The squad moved out. The ground beneath their boots crunched with the remnants of crumbled buildings as they made their way toward the Zeltari command center. With each step, the air felt thicker, the tension hanging heavy. They all knew what was coming. It would be their final stand, or their greatest triumph. As they neared the command center, the first shots rang out. Zeltari soldiers stationed on the outskirts of the complex immediately opened fire. The squad scattered, diving for cover behind the nearest debris. Marlowe barely had time to react before a blast of plasma streaked past her, scorching the ground where she had just been standing. Return fire! Jensen barked, the command slicing through the chaos. Covering fire! Push forward! The squad responded without hesitation, their weapons roaring as they returned fire in unison. Marlowe's rifle bucked in her hands as she targeted one of the advancing Zeltari soldiers. Her aim was precise, the shot dead on, and the enemy soldier dropped with a sickening thud. They pushed forward, every step met with the crack of weapons and the sounds of bodies hitting the ground. But the Zeltari were relentless. For every soldier the humans took down, two more seemed to take their place. The line of fire ahead seemed endless. Marlowe moved with purpose, weaving through the debris with practiced efficiency. Harper was close behind, his face a mask of determination, despite the fear in his eyes. They reached a barricade of scrap metal, crouching low to avoid incoming fire. Captain, Harper panted, we're not going to make it. There's too many of them. We will, Marlowe replied, voice firm. You've got this, Lieutenant. She glanced over her shoulder, locking eyes with Jensen. His squad was still holding, but they were slowly being pushed back. There was no time left to hesitate. She made up her mind in that instant. Jensen, she said over the comms, get your squad to fall back. I'm going after Vrax. Jensen's voice crackled through the comms, disbelief creeping in. Captain, don't be crazy. That's an order, Marlowe snapped, her eyes steely. We take him out, we win this war. Stay focused. I'm going. Without waiting for another word, Marlowe sprinted forward, weaving through the explosions and gunfire. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, but there was no turning back now. She had to do this. The closer she got to the command center, the heavier the resistance. She felt the heat of the plasma shots grazing her skin, but they didn't stop her. Every step brought her closer to Vrax. She could feel his presence now, his power. It was like a shadow hanging over her, daring her to challenge him. But she wasn't about to stop. Finally, she reached the center. There, standing in the midst of the wreckage, was General Vrax, his cold eyes staring directly at her. His soldiers were still regrouping around him, but it was clear who he was waiting for. "You're persistent," Vrax said, his voice low, almost amused. "I will give you that. But persistence is nothing against superiority." Marlowe raised her rifle, ignoring the burn in her shoulder. "We'll see about that." The moment the words left her lips, she pulled the trigger. But Vrax was faster. With a swift motion, he sidestepped the shot, his energy rifle raising in return. Marlowe dove behind a nearby pillar, narrowly avoiding the blast that followed. She knew one thing for sure: this battle wouldn't be won by weapons alone. It would be won by will. And she had the strongest one there was. And this time, she wasn't running. She was going to finish what she had started.